Even if we're not consciously aware of it, grief is often very prevalent and interwoven in our lives. Whether it's people you love having passed on, or you've left a relationship that no longer served you, or even if you're moving into a newer, better version of yourself, we can grieve the loss of what was, even those things that we know weren't really good for us. It can be such a visceral emotion, feeling like we'll never emerge from it. Today we're discussing how to best journey through grief, the importance of and the reason for the grief process, and what to watch out for. And after the discussion, we get to the most important part of this episode. The group frequency calibration at the end is where the frequency work happens and where change actually occurs. So be sure to listen to that. Without releasing distortion patterns targeted by the GFC, the change you want will be more difficult to attain because you haven't addressed the root of the issue. If you like this episode, please hit the subscribe button. My name is Karen Cheong, and today in Mastering Your World Through Frequencies, we're discussing the unexpected connection between grief and growth.
So we're going to talk about grief today. And for me, it's a huge topic. So where do you start? Where do you end? You know, and I'm not sure grief ever ends. And I know for myself, from my own experience, it can be really consuming and feel like I'm never, ever going to get beyond this. So I'm just wondering, at a frequency level, what's actually happening?
Yeah, like why is it so all-consuming?
Why is it so all-consuming?
Yeah, totally. So I'm just going to say that when we're talking about grief, a lot of people associate grief with the death of somebody, right? So the death of a loved one or something like this. But to me, grief is much more interwoven into our lives because it often happens when we transition from one thing to another. So even, for example, if you're a woman and you transition from having your cycle and then not. So when you go into menopause, there's a grief there. There's a grief even when, for example, you move, right? So even if you want to move and you desire to move, there's a grief because you've had your home in this place and you've created a life there and then now you're leaving. Or even when you rise in your frequency resonance. So you used to be a certain way, and you want to grow, you want to change, you want to become better. But the leaving of that version of yourself can be one that invokes grief because it used to be one way and now it's something else. So to me, grief is very interwoven in the human experience. So we're hardwired for it. So it's actually, to me, when I scan, it's hardwired like into our nervous system. So that when we actually leave one thing and move to another, it can feel all-consuming because it's not just emotional to me, it's actually wired into the body, into your nervous system. So it feels like everything's firing on all levels for grief, right? So it's like you think about the loss, you feel the loss, and it's in your body. Yeah. So it can be really difficult to move away from that because in a way, our bodies start to become kind of addicted to that biochemical response.
Oh, a bit like the adrenaline junkie kind of thing.
Or like sugar. If you eat a lot of sugar, your body starts to create a lot of different things to manage that sugar, and our bodies like that response, and they kind of get addicted to it. Or even with a person, right? The chemistry between two people, we kind of like that response, and when that relationship ends, we're seeking that chemical response, even though we think we're looking just for the relationship.
Yeah.
So with grief, it's somewhat similar. Our bodies kind of like hang on to that state of grief, in addition to, even if you want to separate from that grief, emotionally, psychologically, it can be really difficult because the body's hanging on to it.
Because I found myself, like you say, with moving into menopause, I never wanted any more children, I was quite happy, but the idea that moment of time had come to a complete end, like there was no turning back.
Yeah.
I started grieving. I'm like, I don't even know why I'm grieving.
Yeah.
I didn't even understand the response. And then I wondered, this is why I was posing the question. There was an element of appreciation for what had been.
Yeah.
But at the time, I didn't even recognize that would come.
Yes.
And I wasn't sure, okay, so is grief some kind of tool as well that helps us maybe
reflect?
Yeah, reflect and consolidate on something and be ready to take the next step.
Yes.
I'm not sure.
Yeah, I feel like it is because oftentimes when we're grieving, there is introspection. It's like people who are grieving aren't like going out and like, partying typically, unless you're in denial of the grief and you don't want to experience it. That you could do that. But I'm saying if you're actually feeling the grief and you're in it and you're with it, typically it's more inward of an experience. You know what I mean? Like it's not an outward kind of emotional experience. So I do agree with you. I feel like it's a really important part of the human process, I feel like, because it, like you said, it gives you time to reflect, to see how much you have changed, what else has changed around you. And if you're in grief in a way that you can have, you're surrendered to it and also have distance from it, you can see how it's helping you become what you're moving into.
Right. So when you say surrender, so we want to avoid the addiction of it.
Yes.
So when we surrender, we're just allowing this to sweep over us.
Yes, and to have it.
And to give ourselves permission to grieve.
Yeah.
And then at the same time, we're looking for a little bit of distance.
Yeah.
Well, explain that a little bit to me.
So it's interesting. Someone asked me this once, who was in the Living Your Brilliance series, and she had just lost her mom, who she was very close to.
Yeah.
And she's like, well, I feel grief sometimes, but I want to stay in my center. And it was sort of like she thought that not feeling the grief meant that she was neutral, like being in that neutral state with regards to the grief was a positive thing, because she didn't want to experience it too much, because this is the person who's closest to her. And she was afraid of her mother's death the most because she was so close to her. So, but my response to her was, you need to allow yourself to grieve, because that's the human experience. Because if you try to pull yourself into neutrality, it's a false neutrality, because you are human. And so, like I said, it's wired through all of you. So you need to have that emotion to experience it, to have that completion of it. And a lot of people will do a lot of things to avoid experiencing grief, right? So what she was doing was like a false neutrality. She's trying to like not experience it. And some people will distract themselves from grief, like they'll drink a lot, or they'll eat a lot, or they'll be really, 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 really busy so they don't have to experience the grief. That's what I mean by allow, right? So you're grieving, allow grief. And it's not gonna be, it's like like when my dad passed away, I was in grief. I was very close to my father, but it wasn't 24/7. It comes in waves. And at the beginning, the waves last longer. And then as time went on, the waves got shorter, meaning like I would have grief. And still today, it's been, I don't know how many years now since he's passed away, like at least 4 or 5, I can't remember at this particular moment. But there are moments where I grieve my father still, you know? It's not like I've just like chucked the grief. It's just that it's not as long in my experience. It's not as present for as much of the time. So when you say, what do you mean by distance? Okay, so it's to experience the grief and also be aware of your body and being in your center with it. So you don't, it's funny, with grief, we can almost hang on to it because we want to hang on to that experience. The person, the relationship, the circumstance. We kind of confuse the loss with the grief. So we kind of want to hang on to the grief, because like if we let it go, then we really truly let go of that thing that we're moving away from. Do you see what I'm saying? We confuse the grief for the letting go of that person, meaning that we acknowledge that that no longer is, and we are accepting of it and have surrendered to it and are moving, forward from it.
Yeah, I think I've heard something similar where people get anxious and worried because they can't remember.
Yes.
The memory's gone, and they're desperately trying to keep that memory.
Yeah.
And is that the similar kind of thing?
Yes, exactly. And so the grief for them is that anchor to the memory of that person.
Right.
But the thing is, the memory of the person and the grief aren't the same. I mean, we conflate them, meaning we think that they're the same. We try to make them the same, but they're not. So I'm just going to back up. So I said a number of things that may sound contradictory. So one, to allow yourself to grieve, to have it, to stay centered in yourself, to notice if you're trying to hang on to the grief because you're trying to hang on to that person or circumstance or whatever it was, the way it was. To notice why it is you want to attach to that, like why you're afraid of letting that go, to help release those patterns, to focus on releasing those patterns, And then to allow yourself, when you have those moments of grief, to have them, but to stay centered in yourself. And you understand what I'm saying? So that you can experience something other than the grief. Because if we start to attach to the grief, it becomes our anchor point and the primary filter through which we see our reality. And when you start to do that, that starts to color what it is that you're able to experience as a possibility. Because grief, when it's held on to for too long, is heavy. I'm not saying it's not part of the human experience. It is. But if you hang on to it for an extended period of time, beyond, whatever is normal, or whatever, I don't know what normal is, but, whatever is appropriate for you, then it can start to limit where you can go in terms of what you experience in life, because it pulls your resonance down if it's held on to for too long, okay? Having the grief for a period of time, it's like any kind of death experience. You have it, it's heavy, and then you have the experience and you move through it. But I'm talking about if you hold on to it.
Yeah, because it sounds like, so if we're hanging on to that, we're maybe not hanging on to the grief, but we're hanging on to the memories and the loss. Of course, that's going to be heavy because you're being pulled back in time all the time,
that's
right?
So
on the timeline.
Yeah.
Okay, but if we grieve in a way that nurtures us at the same time, I can say nurture because I've seen my husband do it, and a lot of the people in Ireland do it. They celebrate the person's life as opposed to grieving the loss of the person.
Yeah.
But there's grief in it.
Oh, for sure.
But it's in the celebration of the person.
Absolutely. And
I've seen how they can move on quicker, I've noticed.
Yes.
Because of it. Because even if they're remembering, they're remembering a really amazing aspect of the person. Even if it was something that really didn't make them too popular, they can still have a bit of a laugh about it.
Totally.
Right?
Yeah.
And so that's, I guess what I'm understanding is, okay, so maybe there's that little fine difference between the weight of something is the distortion on not letting that loss go.
Yes.
But the grief can be celebratory at the same time,
Absolutely.
right?
Yeah. And it's actually when it becomes celebratory, I feel like that's when you know that you're moving through the journey of grief. So like when my dad passed away, my mom was in grief for a very long period of time. And so what I noticed in her is that she would romanticize her memory of him. So everything that man did in his life was like angelic, okay? I was just like, what, are we remembering the same guy? I love my father, okay? But he was not angelic, all right, just to be clear. So, but she always remembered him as this like, kind of almost like a perfect being. And then what would happen is over time, as she moved through her own journey of grief, and as she released the loss aspect of it, she would remember the things that drove her nuts, but laugh about it. You know what I mean? Like he would always drive me nuts because he would always tell me to be careful when I was crossing the street, but she would give it a laugh, because she appreciated the care. Yeah. So it's almost like this turn that can happen. And because the Irish have it in their culture, that they celebrate that from the get-go, it's almost like they can move through that journey of grief more easily because they're already at that point. There's no like false romanticization of the person or the memory of it, because you don't want to, it's almost like for her, I'm not saying this is the case for everyone, it's like she didn't want to dishonor her memory of him by remembering him as he really was. It's like she had this like image of him that was perfect. And I was like, okay, that wasn't really the experience, but we had to wait for her to get to that point where it was like, okay, this is actually how he was. Yeah. And he was amazing in some ways, and boy, was he a pain in the ass in others.
Like every human being,
like every human,
Yeah, because for me, it's a really tricky point, because I understand there's life after death. I mean, and I know that they're transcending and transforming, and yay, I should be happy for them, but I'm here having this human experience, very human experience, and I'm in pain, and I miss them. I want to pick up the phone and say, hey, how's your day? Or I'm coming over for a cuppa. And they're not there. I mean, how am I supposed to get beyond that? I can't just be happy now. I mean, am I being selfish?
No, not at all. And I think that it's totally normal. I mean, it's funny. That's what I mean by grief is wired into your nervous system. And that's why it feels painful, like physically painful. For some of us. And, we could feel gutted. So there's an expression. It sounds terrible to Americans potentially, or Canadians who are watching this, but there's an expression, in the UK, like feeling gutted when something happens, right? Because it literally feels like you're being eviscerated, right? Some of the pain. And it could be grief for somebody who's passed away. It could be grief from a breakup in a relationship. That feeling, we've all had this feeling when you've broken up with somebody. It feels like you're being eviscerated. Like you're just like, oh my God, it feels terrible. And you're in that grief of that loss, of that connection. So it is normal. And the thing is, it's like your body's wired for it. And so part of the journey through grief is for your body to start also pacing with the release of, meaning release of the loss. Make sense?
Yeah.
It's not, you're not exactly releasing the person. It's like you're releasing the loss. And I feel like as your resonance rises or as your vibrational level rises, part of that is that it's not about not feeling the grief. It's about knowing that it's not all of you. So you still feel your center, you still feel your breath, you still feel your body, you still feel your connection. And you're like, and I'm having this experience that freaking sucks.
Yeah.
And I'm in it, and there's something more. So that's what I mean. It doesn't consume you. It's not like you don't experience it.
Yeah.
It's just that you recognize that it's a human emotion and there is part of you that is bigger than that emotion.
Yeah. That brings me back to that comment that I heard just yesterday. I thought the timing was amazing, where the guy said, he was in grief and he didn't know how to get through it. But then he realized it was never going to leave him.
Yep.
For whatever reason, grief leaves a mark, right? Mm-hmm. But what he understood his job or his part in it was to make himself bigger.
Yeah.
So it got me thinking, okay, so grief, that's why I said, is grief a tool? You go to the depths or the most visceral experience of being human and that loss, but somehow there's this opportunity to make yourself grander or bigger.
Yeah.
And maybe that's, maybe I'm just fantasizing.
I don't think so. I think it depends on your resonance. So in my mind, grief can do a couple things. One is it can have you introspect, appreciate where you were, the person, etc., how much you've grown, and give you context for where you're going. The second thing is it can catalyze tremendous surrender because you're in grief, which is an internal state. So at some point, for some people, that grief is so strong, you have to surrender. There's nowhere else to go. I mean, you can grieve many things, including the loss of a business, the loss of a house, the loss of whatever. It doesn't really matter.
Yeah,
right?
It's grief.
It's grief, right? I mean, your child becoming a teenager, for example.
Oh, yeah.
Right? Because they're no longer little anymore. They're different now. So there's grief in the growing up. I'm saying, grief is everywhere. It's not just in like someone dying.
Yeah.
So the thing is, but it can catalyze surrender in a different way. And when you catalyze surrender, it really pulls you into that present moment and you have the opportunity to be aware of you from the big S self perspective.
Yeah.
You as infinite indestructible consciousness, given the context of the infiniteness that you are, this is this human experience. And in some ways, it's kind of glorious.
Yeah.
I mean, please know, I'm not saying that like grief is amazing, just stay in it. I didn't say that.
No.
I'm just saying that as a visceral human experience, there's something beautiful about it.
There's an opportunity.
Yes.
Yeah.
To see it that way.
Yeah, because I can understand that as a mother with two teenagers and watching them grow and combining everything you said. I can see I'm already grieving. They haven't left the house yet, but I'm already grieving.
Yeah.
And I understand it's a moment for me to do this introspection.
Yeah.
I can see, okay, why is this happening? Why am I grieving already? And I can see everywhere where, oh, okay, so this is where I need to heal or grow bigger.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So I can see how it works that way. And then I can see how you have this moment where it's an extremely human experience and yet you can expand into a grander experience of that again.
Yeah.
So you've got the introspection happening, or the grief, but you've also got this, all right, what's possible?
Yes, exactly.
Right?
Yeah. And the other thing about grief is it's an amazing opportunity to be aware of how you identified yourself in relation to somebody else or something else. And then you're like, okay, do I want that part of my identity? And or can I shift it? It's just like an opportunity, like you said, to introspect, because it's a huge release, right? It's dissolution. That's what grief is, and it's kind of like I've heard a lot in poetry or different native traditions where grief is often like dark waters. Not dark like wah, but I mean, you know what I mean? Like deep waters. And like, okay, so if it's like that, then it's like, well, what is no longer serving me? What can I let go in this grief? Along with this grief, what can I release?
Yeah.
So that's what I mean. It deepens surrender. It is a really tremendous catalyst for surrender. And I'm not trying in this discussion, we're not suggesting that there's no very human emotional pain in it. There is.
Yeah. Very much so.
And it serves a bigger purpose.
Oh yeah, it can.
It can.
Right?
It can.
If you surrender, I think it is possible. I mean, I've seen it and heard it in lots of different countries, and one in particular, a lady, I mean, this is a a topic that no mother ever wants to ever have to face,
Yeah.
you know, the loss of a
A
child. And I've watched this woman grieve in pain, you know, pure pain, and then at the same time watched this woman project her life in a completely different direction and become a new iteration of herself. And it's like, how does this happen, you know? Yet she has never stopped grieving.
Yes.
But she has taken it and went, okay, I gotta make myself bigger.
Yeah.
You know?
Yes. And how do I move through? Because grief is a way, you know, of dealing with the death of something. It's like like everything is cyclical, right? So from this death of this thing that has been lost, a relationship, a way of being, or whatever, a person, what can spring from it? Like what life can come from it, right? And it's not a negation to the grief or the memory of that, you know, the honoring of that relationship, person, whatever it was. It's like, how from this can I become wiser, stronger, contribute more, whatever it is, be more connected, whatever the thing is for you, or all of those things.
Yeah.
You know?
And then it becomes a celebration.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
And I'd also like to touch upon, because like grief has a lot of different faces, and I want to be gentle when I talk about this, you know. But at the same level, I'm really aware that there's a global grief happening. Now, we have the individual grief. And at first I thought I was making it up, but there seems to be this global release or something, or a death or something, that we're all picking up on different ways of grieving.
Yes.
But none of us really know what this grief is. Can you talk to that at all?
So when we move, and so for those of you who've been following what we've been talking about in Mastering Your World Through Frequencies, or the different programs that we offer, I've been talking for a while about a movement from one consciousness level to another. Okay, and people are like, okay, well, that's a nice theoretical idea, but I don't really know what that means. It means that you enter a state where your vibration level is higher, and so meaning your experience of life is different, how we interact between each other is different, how we interact with the earth, how we govern ourselves, everything changes because we become more aware of our oneness. Okay, that's like a very sort of simple way to explain it. But when you leave something that you've known and you move into something else, you grieve it. Okay, that's part of the process of humanness. And so the collective grief is, even though people aren't really aware of it, is we are moving from one consciousness level to another. We've been in this consciousness level for a long time. Your entire lineage has been in this conscious level for like millennia. And now we're shifting. So of course there's grief when that happens. And to me, it's a really good sign, because as you grieve, it's like, well, what can come from that grief? But the grief is required for all the reasons we talked about, right? To assess how it was, how we were in it, can we grow from it, you know, give appreciation for, catalyze surrender, catalyze new growth. So all that, it can be experienced, but it's being experienced now on the collective level. So the grief is important for us as humans to start to tear away from, right? Have introspection for it, but also the momentum to release what it is that was.
Okay, one last question then on that. Do you think it's important as a collective that if we want to move into the new consciousness with more wisdom, that we can take that introspective journey while at the same time going, and how do I grow from that? Do you think that would be a benefit for us?
Yes, absolutely. And I think that the more we do it collectively and also individually, I think it helps everybody, right? Because to me, when the ripple effect of you doing your own inner work radiates out to other people. Okay, so not only does your frequency resonance buoy up, which helps them buoy their frequency resonance up, but they get to see an example of what's possible. It's like, oh, that person's grieving and they're okay with it. They're holding their center, they're with it, and something about them is appealing to me. Like they're not denying their grief, they're journeying through it. So it gives me context for what is happening to me. So it starts to help more people.
So I'm just wondering, will you do a deep dive on grief so that as a collective we can actually start to do these steps that might help us move in with more wisdom?
So after this episode, or associated with this episode, there's a GFC, which is free, that if you're interested in starting to gain the momentum to move through grief, then it's here for you as a tool. And if you need to go deeper, and grief is something that you've had challenge with, or something that you're facing now and you want just a little bit more support, then we have given a deep dive on grief. and the journey through it, which can start to give you the momentum you need to not only journey through it, but to gain the wisdom and to give you momentum moving forward. And if you've enjoyed this episode, please hit the subscribe button or comment below. We're about to start the Group Frequency Calibration, or GFC, where we actually do the frequency work and where change is catalyzed. To get to the GFC, click on the square that'll appear to the right or the link in the description below. It's time to bring in a new experience, a new consciousness, and a new world. Let's rise together.